Okay, hi ladies. I am going to do a quick review of the material so that you feel well prepared for the UK test tomorrow. I wanted to start off with a quick review of Margaret Thatcher, since we didn't get to talk too much about the Iron Lady. As you have read, Margaret Thatcher was the very conservative prime minister from 1979 to 1990, so about just over 10 years. She was ruthless in terms of her beginnings. She thought that the British welfare system was not the way to go. In fact, she hated it so much that she called it the British disease and wanted to abolish it. She felt like people were becoming dependent on the state, and that was not going to contribute to a stronger economy. Further, during a economic depression, a welfare state is very expensive and often is funded by tax dollars. And she wanted to find ways to cut taxes and reduce social expenditures so that people would, in a sense, become more self-sufficient. She hated the welfare system and called it the British disease. Her legacy is ongoing today. First of all, she was the shadow leader in around 1975. And remember, the shadow leader is the person on the minority party who holds the kind of parallel position. So there's a prime minister, and then in the majority party, and then there's a shadow prime minister. So it's the kind of leader of the minority party, and she was the shadow leader in 1975. And then during the Winter of Discontent, the Winter of Discontent was a time when basically lots of garbage workers went on strike, along with several other public services. But the one that gets the most press and was kind of the big tipping point was the garbage strike. And basically, imagine not having your garbage picked up for several months on end. And the garbage workers were on strike because they were unionized and they felt like they weren't getting enough money for what they were doing. And during a tough economic time, they were really struggling to get by. And so they went on strike for a pay raise. And the City of London was very, very, very stinky during the Winter of Discontent. On top of that, there were several other industries that went on what are called secondary strikes. This is one of your vocab words. And secondary strikes are when another group of people goes on strike. They don't have beef with the government, but they're doing it kind of in solidarity with the people who are on strike. So for our example, think about when BART workers went on strike. Often we saw that a lot of the Muni workers also went on strike. So that happens quite a bit, secondary strikes. Margaret Thatcher was absolutely ruthless when it came to secondary strikes. She refused to bargain at all and said basically, well, if they're on strike, let them starve. Because, of course, if you're on strike, you're not working. And if you're not working, you're not earning money. And if you're not earning money, it's very hard to feed your family. So she basically said, let them strike, and then we will see what happens. And then what she would do is she would send in people who would offer, for example, the coal miners, which we're going to talk about in just a second. The coal miners who went on strike, they would send somebody in and say, well, we'll offer you $10,000 if you take this buyout and sign away your rights and say that you are not going to go on strike anymore, and then you would just leave and you have to go find a different job. And this was very controversial because other people who were coal miners said, no, this is our livelihood. This is all we are skilled to do. This is all we know how to do. So we need this job. We can't go just get another job. We have to have this one. And so it was a big deal because often people who were friends were split. Sometimes houses were split. If their father was a coal miner and the son was also a coal miner, the father would want to stay, but the son said, look, $15,000 or £15,000 is a lot of money. I could use that money. I could start a new life. So it was very controversial. But Margaret Thatcher was hated by unions because she was very anti-union, and she was well known for, quote unquote, breaking the unions, like she did during the Winter of Discontent. Sorry. Let's see. So anyway, she was very hardcore during the Winter of Discontent and spoke out very vocally about the garbage strikers and how she felt like they were they needed to be broken, and public sentiment was with her in this respect because they had piles of stinky garbage, and honestly they didn't care how it got picked up, but they just wanted it gone. So it helped her to win, and the Conservative Party to win in 1979, and when she became the Prime Minister. Margaret Thatcher, like I said, was very against the welfare state, and she was also very against taxes. This was during an economic depression when times were tough, and taxes, of course, are taxing on the people who have to pay them. So she was against the welfare state and against taxes, which are generally used to pay for the welfare state. She was against nationalization and for privatization. So you'll remember from the reading, nationalization is when you have a company, for example, British Petroleum used to be run by the national government. However, under Margaret Thatcher, right around 1979, British Petroleum was shifted to be a private enterprise. And that's privatization, when something shifts from being a kind of public commodity to being a private commodity. And generally, if it's a private commodity, it is run for profit, and it is run with the benefit of shareholders in mind. So people wanted to, if you were the CEO, your main goal was not as much for the benefit of the people, it was more to make money. So Margaret Thatcher was very much in favor of privatizing these industries so that the government wouldn't have to have the additional cost of having to help run these big industries. She was also against labor unions, which I talked a bit about earlier, specifically civil service unions. So lots of unions, and bear in mind the political party for these labor unions was the opposite of what Margaret Thatcher. So Margaret Thatcher was a conservative and part of the Conservative Party, and then we have the Labour Party, which tends to represent unions. Margaret Thatcher was going after unions like crazy, and so it drove people who were part of the union further and further towards the Labour Party and further away from the Conservative Party. There was an economic decline. However, Margaret Thatcher's really kind of stark, some people would say draconian policies helped to stem the economic decline. In some ways, she helped by privatizing industry. It gave a kind of immediate bump to the economy, but the long-term benefits are sometimes questionable. In office, Thatcher's legacy was lower taxes. Taxes went down. She cut taxes like crazy, in part because she had lower expenses because industries were privatized instead of nationalized. She was big on entrepreneurship. She felt that Brits were very capable of running their own businesses, and she helped sometimes to fund these entrepreneuring endeavors. She was also a big fan of competition. Economic competition, for those of you who have or have not taken economics classes, economic competition can help to drive down prices. So she felt like progress is best achieved through competition, which I would agree with, but she was bringing competition to a whole new level of where it was driving down prices so low that people were having a hard time staying profitable, or companies were having a hard time staying profitable. She was also for privatization and against nationalization of big industries, examples including coal and oil, British oil, and the train system, things like that. She was also against council homes, and we talked a bit about this in class. Council homes are basically public housing. So she said that she was very anti-public housing and shut down lots of public housing. What this meant is that there was an increase in homelessness across the country, and the poor couldn't afford very much. So if you were working for one of these unions that she went after, a coal worker, maybe in the north of England, and maybe you were living in public housing with your family, and that's how you were making ends meet, she went after these public housing, after unions, so you were out of a job, out of a home, and so it was a really dire time for the lower classes. Again, the Conservative Party tends to represent the middle upper class, and so her policies tended to most represent their needs. Again, she declared war on unions, breaking them as much as she could. Specifically the Coal Miners' Union, 1984 to 1985, very much against secondary strikes. She said that there is no alternative to achieve what she wanted to achieve, so she felt like she didn't have an option. And in truth, her economic policies did work. Inflation was down. Remember inflation from that podcast you all listened to? Because you all listened to that, I think. Inflation was down. So it really did work in some ways, but at what cost for the lower classes? So it was tough. Again, unemployment and homelessness was up. And so while she was in office, the Falklands War happened, and we talked about this a bit with Sierra's presentation. Falklands are just off the coast of Argentina. They're disputed lands held by something like 5 or 6 different countries. If you want more information on this, more specifically, check out Sierra's awesome handout. And Margaret Thatcher didn't want the British Empire to break up on her watch, so they went to war with Argentina and eventually won out and got to keep the Falkland Islands. This helped her to get re-elected in 1984 up until 1989 or 1990 when John Major took office. John Major was... The famous quote is, "He governed but never led," from the Tories. He didn't have a backbone, and often he was accused of not knowing what type of ideology he held. There's some very stark criticisms of him. Although he did lead the way for the UK to join the EU, a couple of bad things happened on his watch. One of them was BSE, or mad cow disease. Like my mad cows, one is an angry cow. There was a big EU ban on British beef, and farmers were forced to slaughter hundreds and hundreds of animals. And the farmers organized to petition government for compensation. On a side note, I lived in England during this time, and right around 2000, and I still can't give blood because I lived over there just for a year, but I lived over there during that time period, and so I'm not allowed to give blood ever because just in case I have a little bit of mad cow disease. So sorry guys. Under John Major too, there was a big scandal. There were a bunch of members of the cabinet under John Major who were found to be really, really sleazy, aka they were having extramarital affairs, there was tons of corruption, underage girls. It was really skeezy, and it was called the sleaze, so you'll hear that a little bit. Then we move up to Ireland and the Irish Republican Army. They were a guerrilla terrorist group from 1919 to 1921 who fought against British rule in Ireland. They mostly fought in Dublin and Belfast, and it led up to Bloody Sunday, which was fought in Belfast, where 500 people died fighting against British rule. Check out Tati's handout if you want more information about Ireland. I also was able to interview Mr. Ryan, and I have this awesome kind of podcast for you guys to listen to. I'm having trouble transferring it onto Haiku, so I'll figure it out, and hopefully I'll post it online tonight. So I'll post an announcement before our review session at 8 o'clock. Again, John Major was known as being ideologically bankrupt. People didn't really know what his policy was. He didn't really have a clear ideology about key issues, and people didn't really like him because of that. And so when it came time, John Smith was put in office after John Major left. The crazy thing is John Smith suddenly died, leaving Tony Blair as the prime minister, and Tony Blair was a pretty big deal. We talked a little bit about him. He started this party called New Labour, and it was also known as the Third Way. The Third Way is the idea that there's the Conservative Party, there's the traditional Labour Party, and then there was New Labour, which was Tony Blair's new party. And so he called that the Third Way. Big thing, they rewrote the Labour Charter to remove the Article 4 from the Charter, which called the Labour Party a socialist party. This was a big move. So Tony Blair moved the Labour Party more mainstream and slightly away from the far left, which is where they previously were. Before, you had Conservative Party on the far right, Labour on the far left, and Tony Blair was more centrist, and so he moved. New Labour was in the middle, and so that's why it was called the Third Way. And revising the charter to be less socialist showed that he recognized that there was maybe some validity to some of Margaret Thatcher's policies, and that he recognized that that was where the majority of the people found themselves, in between the two parties, not at either of the two extremes. So the 1997 general election was when Tony Blair was elected. It ended the 18 years prior when the Conservative Party had been in power, and New Labour Party is what it was called. New Labour synonymous with the Third Way. Big things. So Tony Blair and New Labour ran on two big platforms, one of which was improving the NHS waitlists. So if, for example, say I was diagnosed with cancer, and actually Sarah Niehaus did a great presentation on her current event about NHS wait times, but say I was diagnosed with cancer, for example, it could take me up to 3 months to be seen by a doctor. As some of you may know, cancer can move very quickly, and so sometimes it left people very, very sick who weren't able to get medical care. So they ran on the platform of improving NHS waitlists and also improving class sizes in classrooms. Class sizes had just gotten to be very big over time, and they felt like they needed to be reduced. There was also another sleaze campaign, or sleaze incident, under Tony Blair with Lord Mendelsohn. Lord Mendelsohn was accused of breaking the rules for the House of Lords. He was a member of the House of Lords, and this helped lead Tony Blair to examine the hereditary peers rule. So if you remember back to the very beginning, and you can flip back to the very beginning of this presentation of the slides, and if you remember the hereditary peers, they're the members of the House of Lords who just inherited their role as a lord. And so there were over 700 of these peers. Tony Blair took a look at that and said, look, just because your dad's dad did something nice for a king doesn't really mean that you need to be in the House of Lords. Plus, the House of Lords was largely just titles at this point. They don't really have much power. So he actually worked and reduced the number of lords in the House of Lords from 700 down to 94. So now you will look and there are only 94 lords or hereditary peers in the House of Lords. He also had the big decision about whether or not to join the euro. He decided against the euro, but left it open to potentially embracing it one day. And as we talked about in class, in Britain there is a kind of sentimentality towards the pound and the pound sterling. It got them through World War II and World War I, and people are just very attached to the pound. And it's a fairly strong currency nationwide. And so they decided against the euro, but left it open, maybe someday. He also raised minimum wage. You'll remember that Tony Blair is part of the Labour Party, so representing the kind of lower class, who were the traditional laborers, and so this gained him a huge boost. Raising the minimum wage was a huge boost with his more traditional followers, who really appreciated the pay boost. Fun little fact, Tony Blair was in this band in the early 1970s called the Ugly Rumors. So this is him with long hair. Kind of a fun fact, but it was a Grateful Dead cover band. You might be able to find some of their music online, I bet, but so far I've been lucky enough not to hear it. In 2001, there was the general election, and Tony Blair stayed Prime Minister, and New Labour stayed as the majority party. So that's a good date to keep in mind. 2001 was the general election. Then there was the 2005 general election. This was tricky. There was this guy named Reginald Keyes who ran against Tony Blair in Tony Blair's own district. So you'll remember that to be a member of the House of Parliament, you have to be elected by your district, right, using the SNDP system. So you're elected to the House of Parliament, and then within the House of Parliament, within your party, people choose who gets to be which role. So who's the Prime Minister, who is the Cabinet. So the members of Parliament decide that among themselves for each party, and same thing with the shadow cabinet. So Reginald Keyes ran against Tony Blair in his own district. Reginald's son had died in the Iraq War, and he blamed Tony Blair personally. This was really embarrassing for Tony Blair because he asked Tony Blair in one of his Prime Minister's question times how many people died in Iraq, and Tony didn't know. And it was publicized widely, and it showed a sort of ignorance and callousness about the war in Iraq that was it was a pretty big deal. People weren't happy that their Prime Minister didn't know how many UK citizens had gone to die. You'll also remember that collective consensus, if somebody is from your own party and you're in Parliament, you don't speak out against them. It's just it's bad form. So there's this idea that if you are all one party, you can speak behind closed doors. You can debate and say, look, I don't agree with that. But once you're out in Parliament, you all put forth a united front against the other side. And Reginald Keyes ran against it. So he broke collective consensus. And Tony Blair started losing seats, and so did the Labour Party. They lost several seats in several districts and to Conservative members. And the London bombings didn't help. So the London bombings happened in July of 2005, and there were several bombs that went off all over the city and killing hundreds of Londoners. It later came out that this was perpetrated by Al-Qaeda, and members of Al-Qaeda, and people were prosecuted, but it's really hard to prepare at all for these kind of incidences, and people think that this incident specifically was handled very poorly. Okay, this is the big deal. The Terrorism Act of 2006 is what was Tony Blair's downfall. This is why he wasn't reelected. The Terrorism Act of 2006, Tony Blair wanted police to hold people without charging them, so without charging them for 90 days. They wanted to increase it from, I think it was 2 weeks, so 14 days, all the way up to 90 days. That's a long time. That's 3 months without trial, without a charge, so you could just be picked up off the street and held. And Tony Blair's party, the Labour Party, said, heck no, there's no way we're going to allow that. And behind closed doors, they said, no way, this is a really bad idea, we don't like this. But after the London bombings, Tony Blair felt this pressure to be able to do something about it. And the police were saying, look, we need to be able to charge these people, and we need to have enough time to be able to come up with charges against these people, but we want them off the street. So despite the Labour Party strongly pushing back and saying, no way, we really do not like this law, Tony Blair went ahead and tried to pass it. That didn't go over so well. He lost the bill, and he lost his party, and they did end up changing it. They made it a little bit longer. They bumped it up to 28 days, which is still a really long time. It's still a month without a charge, but it's a lot less than 90 days. And the damage was done. The idea that Tony Blair didn't listen to any of his own party and that he went ahead and pushed ahead with this legislation, which so many people disagreed with, really was his undoing. That, combined with public opinion about the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, and the idea that Tony Blair was George W. Bush's kind of puppet almost, and that he would do whatever he needed to do to stay on the U.S.'s good side. So public opinion was down. Then the Terrorism Act of 2006 happened, and Tony Blair was just donezo. He was shown as being out of touch, and he actually resigned. So the Queen elected Gordon Brown, selected Gordon Brown, he was kind of the hand-picked successor, as Prime Minister. He was commissioned by the Queen. And he was all right, but he was shown to not have much political savvy. He was a little bit more socialist on the spectrum, so he moved away from the idea of New Labour and moved back towards the traditional Labour. And he wasn't very popular. He was fine, but people weren't really that thrilled with him. These are some old school pictures of him, which is kind of fun. So in the 2010 general election, Blair lost popularity thanks to involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, but despite public opinion. So this is the 2010 general election. So the most recent general election. And there were 326 seats needed to have a majority. Labour needed 326 seats. And there was a coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. Labour became the minority party. Remember that pendulum we talked about? So it swung back the other way. Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats combined together to get 326 seats. And David Cameron was elected. So he was elected in 2005. Amongst a bunch of major issues, there was an economic recession. You want to know what the term austerity measures are? Austerity measures are when times are really tough and the government has to make budget cuts. And it's not the best idea. There isn't really any extra fat to be cut, and it's tough. It means times are really tough. So, but he did what he had to do to maintain the coalition. You will want to know what the Jenkins Report was. The Jenkins Report was, we're going to jump back in time a little bit. The Jenkins Report was commissioned by the New Labour Party to review the electoral system. Basically, they wanted to change the electoral system from what was the first past the post system to, or what is now, to a hybrid SMDP plus PR system. The Jenkins died in 2003, and nothing's really changed yet. And even though this was commissioned by New Labour, the Liberal Democrats were all over this. This was straight up their alley because, in part, you want to look at the numbers. Remember, the Liberal Democrats don't have very high numbers. The two major parties are the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. But in proportional representation, if you remember back to the system, you can get smaller parties with higher levels of representation. SMDP lends itself to a two-party system, Labour and Conservative, and so the Liberal Democrats have a hard time squeezing their voice in, but in a proportional representation system, they would have a lot more say. That's very important to know, that the Liberal Democrats would really favor a proportional representation system, and this was all kind of started by the Jenkins report. You definitely want to know the term devolution, or as they would say in England, devolution. Sometimes we call it devolution. Devolution is the decentralization of some power away from the House of Commons. Step towards federalism, remembering that the UK is a unitary state. So it's a step towards federalism, but, and this is a big but, power could be taken away from the local communities at any time. So Scotland and Wales got assemblies, London got its own mayor, and Northern Ireland also got its own assembly. So these assemblies have more control of local issues, for example, property tax, and it's been pretty successful so far, except for in Northern Ireland and with the Mayor of London. The Mayor of London his name is Boris Johnson, and oh my god, check out his hair if you get a chance. It looks fake. It's not. He has this shock of blonde hair that is pretty heinous. That's really not important for the AP exam, but just a fun fact. You'll recognize him from afar if you ever see him. Another thing to know about is the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. The BBC, all citizens are taxed for public television, public radio, which is something which is somewhat controversial in the UK. Some people are reluctant to pay these because they don't feel like they should be paying for it. They feel like it should be something provided by the state, right, as part of a welfare state. But I have to say, their programming is fantastic. A lot of the TV shows we get here today are shows that were originally BBC shows that have been moved to the American market. They show really objective coverage of many issues and a variety of programming. So they're truly pretty fantastic media coverage. So it's where I get a lot of my news. Okay, big terms to know. The Prime Minister enforces party discipline. So think about that, party discipline. It's the idea that you're voting with your party or kind of behaving in the way that everybody else in your party is behaving in several ways. One of the big terms is the idea of collective responsibility. And I alluded to that earlier. Collective responsibility is when the ministers and the Prime Minister, they can argue privately about a policy, but once the policy is agreed to, the entire cabinet presents a positive front to the public and to the media. So cabinet reshuffles. Remember the cabinet? The Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's ministers are part of the cabinet. And reshuffles are not uncommon. And they reward loyalty and punish disloyalty. So if you vote with your party and are doing a good job and behaving well, you could end up in the cabinet. If you start voting and speaking out against the Prime Minister's policies, you may be demoted. And that's pretty common. So good behavior is kind of rewarded. And then remember, this is another good term to know, who the backbenchers are. The backbenchers are basically any of the people who are not in the cabinet. So if you are not the Prime Minister and you're not one of the ministers, the Prime Minister and the ministers sit in the front, and then the backbenchers are the people who sit on the back benches. So they are kept in line by the lure of having a safe seat. A safe seat is a district from which the party generally wins. So you vote with the party, or lose the safe seat come election time. So it's the idea that if you start voting against the party, you may be assigned to one of the more risky districts, with the idea that the party wouldn't mind so much if they were to lose you from their party. But if you are essential to the party, they might assign you to a district where they know your party will win so that you will stay in Parliament. Okay, a free vote happens in matters of conscience, not a party line, and ethical decisions like age of gay sex and fox hunting. So those happen every once in a while. You'll have what they call a free vote, and that means that people are free to vote however they see fit. They don't need to vote along party lines. They just can vote whatever they believe. And so it's kind of nice that they have that on issues so that sometimes the party may not have as much of a stance on those ethical issues. Again, issues with Northern Ireland. There was a big civil war from 1970 pretty much to the present. The IRA is the Irish Republican Army, and the Orange Order is the paramilitary on the other side. It's pretty brutal. The IRA is known as a terrorist group, and they would set off bombs and in churches and sometimes schools, and it was pretty violent and very scary for a while. Again, refer to Toddy's handout for more information on this. You definitely want to have a good overview of what's going on in Northern Ireland. I also interviewed Mr. Ryan, and will post this podcast as soon as I can figure out how to get it up for you guys. These are some pictures. So the groups involved, there's the radical groups are the UDP, Ulster Democratic Party, and remember Ulster is Northern Ireland, and then there's Sinn Féin, which is the political wing of the IRA, and they have 5 seats in the House of Commons, but they stay empty, which is interesting. The less radical groups are the Ulster Unionist Party, the Social Democratic and Labour Party, and the Democratic Unionist Party. They're not officially connected to military groups, but sometimes they make bargains, and it's very, very complicated. There's a lot going on in Northern Ireland, and there is also a little bit of tension between the UK or England and Ireland, which you'll learn a lot about in the podcast, which I will post. So the Good Friday Peace Agreement happened in 1998, and Bill Clinton was able to send over a gentleman who helped to broker this peace treaty, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize for it, as a matter of fact, in 1998. And there were over 3,000 deaths in 1970 in just Northern Ireland. So Bill Clinton sent over this guy, whose name is escaping me right now, but he won the Nobel Peace Prize and peace agreements. There are 4 parts to the peace agreements. There's referenda, each in Ulster, which basically really separated Northern Ireland from the Republic of Ireland, and Northern Ireland was to receive its own assembly so more devolution, and there was a big disarming. Both paramilitaries had to turn in their weapons within a year. There was a lot of resistance, but eventually everybody did. They handed in their weapons. The referenda were passed in both parts of Ireland, 99% in the Republic of Ireland and 75% in Northern Ireland. So what's happened since? Murderers were released, the wording was removed, Northern Ireland got their own assembly, and while groups hesitated on disarming, it took way more than a year, but it finally just happened pretty recently. Big UK issues. You'll remember Ali's presentation on the Scottish National Party and Shirley's presentation on the British National Party. Both are extremist groups. The Scottish National Party wants independence for Scotland. They want their own state, right? Currently, there are many nations within. So you could say the UK is a multi-nation state, right? Because you've got the nation of Scotland, the nation of Northern Ireland, the nation of Wales, and the nation of England, all within the UK. So the Scottish National Party wants their own nation, or they want their own state, sorry. And the British National Party is very xenophobic. They are crazy, violent, extremist. They want out of the EU, and they want to reinstate the death penalty. Education, you should know that public schools are not the same as public schools here. Public schools in the UK are actually private and very exclusive. They prepare pupils for public service, which is why they're called public schools, and they generally lead to Oxford and Cambridge, which you may have heard referred to as Oxbridge. It's a combination of the two schools. Oxbridge is not actually a place, and there are generally more connections. State schools are regular education funded by tax money, so what we would call public schools. And the big issue in the UK is how to provide better schools and better education. There are trust schools, independently established with control over admissions and budget, kind of like our charter schools, and there are mergers between high and low performing schools. Another big issue is the NHS. There's long wait times, paid for by tax money. Almost everyone uses the NHS, National Healthcare System. A few people have private insurance as a backup. Refer to Sarah Niehouse's presentation. Class is a big issue. There's still really big social class cleavages all around the UK. Basically, there's the working class, the middle class, and although they have a lot of people in the service sector, right, helping to make it an advanced democracy and a post-industrial democracy, the UK still has really big class cleavages. So, remember that tour of the UK in accents we talked about? Accents are a great way that people tend to differentiate people from their class to other classes. Let's see. Okay, and I think that's it for today. Don't forget that we have